Well, greetings, lovely to see you again. And now we're going to move on into what is the topic is known as market structures. And essentially it's about looking at a theoretical model known as perfect competition and looking at the characteristics or features of what makes a perfect market or perfect competition, and then comparing it to actual real-world markets, in other words, imperfect markets. And the essential idea is that a market will be more perfect when there is more competition, because more competition will mean lower prices. So, having said that, let's now move through and look more closely. So perfect competition is a theoretical model. It sets out the ideal conditions to ensure that the price of a product will be as low as possible to the consumer. So that is our primary or fundamental characteristic that we're looking for. Imperfect competition is made up of real-world market structures that have some of the features of perfect competition. They are imperfect because these markets do not have all the features or characteristics or requirements of perfect competition. What are the requirements? Number one, and this is the most fundamental, there have to be many buyers and sellers. More sellers means greater competition, which means lower prices. All buyers and sellers are price takers. They have no influence over the market price. They cannot influence it. Now, we've already had a glimpse of this when we've looked at international trade, looking at New Zealand as either an exporter in the world market or an importer from the world market. So we'll look at this in the next slide. Thirdly, there are no barriers to enter the market, which means the maximum number of sellers will be in the market, meaning lower prices. And there are no barriers to leave the market. And this is important to make sure that the most efficient producers are producing the goods. Otherwise, average costs will be higher and the prices will be higher. Fourthly, the products are homogeneous or homogeneous. So the only thing that influences the buyer's choice is price. In this way, products are not differentiated. So homogeneous means identical, exactly the same. Doesn't matter where you go, exactly the same. Differentiated means to make the product different or appear to be different. So there can be real or actual differences, advertising, packaging, sponsorship, branding, all ways to differentiate the product, to make the product be better or appear to be better than the competitors. But in perfect competition, there's no differentiation of product. Why? Because all products are homogeneous. Let's look more closely at the price taker concept. Remember, just like in the international trade model, New Zealand producers were just one of many, many sellers in the world market. So if we're talking about the milk market, even if it's in New Zealand, one individual dairy farmer makes up many, many small sellers in that market. So we say that the price that is set in this market will determine the price the individual farmer will get for his milk. The good thing is that he can sell all he wants at that price, but he can't influence it because he's too small. And so it would be very foolish, for example, for him to decrease output from 2,000 to 1,000 litres, hoping to to somehow affect the market supply and cause it to move left and push the price up. It would never happen. So the farmer can sell all he wants at the existing price, but there's no incentive to lower prices because he certainly won't sell any more, and he'll just lose revenue. Remembering, revenue is price times quantity. The third barrier, the quality that was mentioned, was that there cannot be any barriers to enter or leave the market. And no barriers to enter means the maximum number of sellers will be in the market, and therefore the price will be lower, which is the essential aim. And of course there can't be any barriers to leave the market, so you might have people, for example, who have a family business. They're not very efficient producers, but they're there because the business was handed from father to son. And so the business, in fact, should really perhaps close down. It should not be operating because its cost structure is much higher, and so it's selling at a higher price. So we would say it's actually better for the market and resource allocation that only the efficient sellers will be in the market operating. So there can't be any barriers to enter or leave a perfect market for perfect competition. So no obstacles to start a business or to leave a business. Now, some examples of barriers, I've already mentioned one, just family ties. But the most common, of course, setting up a business is having enough money to be able to buy the equipment and set up the business. So we say set-up or start-up costs are a very common barrier for new sellers to enter a market. Access to finance directly related to that. Legal barriers. The government will often require licenses to operate, so you have to meet a certain standard before you'll be given that license. Restaurants, for example, have to meet safety requirements and also hygiene standards because they're supplying food, of course. There can be rules about where you set your business up, known as zones or zoning laws, and of course copyright or patents, same thing, where for you to be able to enter that market you have to buy the right or the copyright to be able to do that. And finally, availability of resources, finding suitable land, office space, maybe skilled labour is a problem before you can actually set up your business. 3 more requirements that we will revisit when we begin section B to look at market failure. But for a market to be perfectly competitive, all buyers have to have perfect information about the product. That means only buy the best product available. None of us could really say that when we've purchased something that we know all about that product, about the best place to buy it, etc. But in perfect competition, that is assumed to be true. Sellers also have perfect knowledge about their product, ensuring that they'll produce it in the most efficient way. Therefore, average costs will be lower, and that will guarantee or ensure that prices will be as low as possible. And finally, all resources have to be perfectly mobile, which means they have to move to where they're required. For example, if demand increases for a product, there will be a shortage in the market, so the price will rise. As the price rises, producers want to increase quantity supplied. If they can't get the resources they need to increase quantity supplied, the shortage will persist. And in perfect competition, resources have to be perfectly mobile to be able to respond to the need to increase quantity supplied. So that was perfect competition, but now we're going to look at the real world, at market structures in the real world. And this course doesn't really focus on these individual structures, and as you'll see, we're only really going to focus on what we will call imperfect competition. Now, the reason these markets are imperfect is because they haven't got all the characteristics of perfect competition. So we'll start with the least perfect, the one with the most likely to have the highest prices, and that's monopoly. You've got one large seller. Mono, of course, means one. Duo, two. Duopoly, two large sellers. Oligopoly, oli means a few, so a few large sellers. And finally, a name that's a little bit confusing because it seems similar to monopoly but is not. It's called monopolistic competition. Very common markets where you've got many small sellers operating, and they're very competitive. So if we made a list from the highest to the lowest in terms of competitiveness, monopolistic competition would be the most competitive because it's got lots of sellers. Oligopoly, duopoly, and then of course monopoly's only got one big seller, so there is no direct competition. So it's much more likely the price will be higher as the number of sellers decrease in a market. So let's run through some of the characteristics of each of these markets. They're very similar. Monopoly, one large seller, so there are no close substitutes. Now this could be a doctor in a small town. There may only be one doctor, so you've got immediately a monopoly. Or it could be across all of New Zealand, or in a particular region. It's hard to get in. It's hard to get into these markets and start producing, quite often because there are strong barriers to enter. It could be finance, or it could be qualifications, or availability of resources, the things we looked at previously. So the strong barriers to enter. He's a price maker, not a taker. He's a price maker because he's the only seller, and he still will differentiate his product, even though there's only one. He's the only seller. He will differentiate it to try and shift his demand curve to the right so that more people will use his product or service. Duopoly and oligopoly. Remember, duo, two, oli, a few. So again, why are there just two or a few sellers in the market? Because it will be difficult to get into that market. There'll be strong barriers. These guys won't be price makers, but they'll have a strong control over their price. They'll be able to influence the price because there's a few big sellers only in the market. The product will be differentiated. Banks are a good example of this. In New Zealand and most countries, got a few big banks, and basically they have strong control over their prices, and they offer a differentiated product, different services, different accounts, etc. And the last market form is very common, where you have many small sellers and therefore lots of substitutes, and it's pretty easy to set up. It's easy to enter the market, so we say there are weak barriers to enter. Think of a restaurant. Lots of immigrants come to New Zealand. They can't get jobs with their qualifications because they're not recognised. So they set up a restaurant because they can cook their national food, and it's relatively easy to do. There are not too many barriers. You need a bit of money. You need to find a suitable place. You've got the skills to cook, and because you know the food, and so a lot of immigrants have actually set up when they arrive and operate restaurants. And so they also have weak control over price. The reason they have little control over the price is because there are lots of sellers. More sellers means basically you've got less control. If you put your prices up, you're taking a big risk of losing a lot of customers, market share. And of course, differentiated product. Is Chinese food the same as French food? Certainly not. So, mobile phones in New Zealand, you've got Telecom, Vodafone and 2 Degrees are the three big ones, basically oligopoly. New Zealand Postal Service is monopoly. Petrol suppliers, oligopoly. There are only a few brands of petrol being offered, and so you have a few big sellers. Restaurants, we've mentioned, monopolistic competition. How many Chinese restaurants in Auckland? No idea. Are they all the same? Certainly not. And of course, all the other different types of food offered in Auckland. Banks, we said, oligopolies. The corner dairy shop that originally started as a place where cow's milk was delivered so that people who didn't have farms could actually buy it. And they developed into offering a service open long hours where you could buy the basic things that was nearby your home. Kiwi Rail is a monopoly. Of course, there's only one set of railway tracks basically, and normally when it comes to those sort of networks, you only have one owner, one large owner, so which we call, of course, a monopoly. Electricity supply nationally in New Zealand, we've actually got 3, so it is an oligopoly.